From cancel culture to QAnon, our social engineering toward the Great Reset is everywhere in evidence. Since the wild and woolly days of the early internet, we have allowed ourselves to be herded into a handful of social media platforms. All the better to control the narrative, my dear. Now free speech in America is all but dead, at least bludgeoned into silence with shrill virtue signaling screeches of fake news, misinformation, and even that's hate speech. The most of us are sufficiently cowed, and the rest of us, like myself, reduced to dancing around issues with awkward, evasive language in a furtive attempt to avoid the slings and arrows of outrageous algorithm, which trigger the deplatforming beneath our feet, dangling us silent at last from the gallows. My friends in Africa, with violence, corruption, and poverty on all sides, face the very real prospect of death at an early age. In the meantime, fat and sassy in America, at least for the moment, we care not much for our sisters and brothers across the water. We are far too busy responding like trained seals, the cues given, our buttons pushed, our inevitable responses to lifelong programming surreptitiously activated. Too narcissistically obsessed or starving for the meaning and purpose that the power elite proffers to us in the guise of changes in the weather and so-called sexual identities, it is not even on the radar in these woken, not roaring 20s. The hunger and the refusal of health care to the poor and to the children who routinely suffer and even die among our friends in the world's neglected places. No, our twisted fantasy of saving Gaia is to scream self-righteously in one another's faces about pronouns, shave our genitalia, and applaud dehumanizing stereotypes of despised groups like older white males with the very same hand we virtue signal with. These woke haters and flag idolatry Trumptards do not seem to have a clue that they are doing exactly what the power elite wants them to do. Following Sleazy Joe's mandates at the Donald's warp speed, those souls with the naivete to buy into the false left-right paradigm lined up in massive majorities to take their medicine. An unnatural fear of death by the relatively young and healthy had them clamoring to inject a genetics manipulating agency into their bloodstream because they trusted the science. A trust so thick-headed and blind that beloved parents and children were buried alone. Long careers faithfully served were lost amidst curses and accusations hurled by trusted colleagues and fellow citizens, questioning their morals and even their sanity. These vociferous accusers, the word accuser translated from the Hebrew Hashatan as Satan, these accusers were conspicuously mum when the trusted science apparently erred, overpromised, and underdelivered. Prognostication that their solution ensured you would never catch our latest plague, nor would you give it to anyone. So effective was this enthronement of an often clueless medicalization of our daily lives that this very moment on this very platform, I cannot exercise the freedom of speech that I'd like. You are not allowed to make up your own mind without condescending meddling by the proper authorities. Therefore, I am forced to speak obliquely and in obfuscating code. This is not the same America from just a few years ago, and we ain't seen nothing yet. The medicalization of our daily lives is a major plank in the platform of the Great Reset. The medicalization in conjunction with digital identity will go a long way to establishing the new biosecurity state in a full spectrum dominant surveillance society. What we have been through these last few years is a test run to see where the weak spots are. Much, much more is on the way. Nonetheless, medicalization has already proved that it can completely control our movements or deprive us of movement altogether. Where did such power come from, and what are the premises, the axiomatic assumptions upon which it is built? It will, of course, come as no surprise that our healthcare has grown out of the narrow interest of a powerful few, not out of concern for the public welfare and our general well-being, but instead out of concern for capital and control. Every day, our prison is being built, and it is we ourselves who are laying the bricks and filling in the mortar. This construction will not be stopped, but perhaps some of us can devise a breakaway society of sorts that peacefully coexist outside of it, at least for a while. So with the prospect of inciting a few more of us to walk out of Babylon, and perhaps even explore the rudiments of networking an alternative beloved community, we will examine the future visions and distant echoes of the early modern medical establishment, the money and motives behind it, and the basic theories of how disease is contracted and spread, which was debated much more openly before the current era. Our current medical mode of treatment is called allopathic, with the default treatment of drugs and surgery. Before achieving unchallenged predominance, allopathic medicine shared the stage with homeopathy, osteopathy, naturopathy, and other alternatives. According to British professor and former intelligence agent Nicholas Hager, our modern power structure grew out of businesses originally started by the Rothschild and Rockefeller families. This structure now involves several hundred families and thousands of businesses. The Rockefellers were especially prominent in devising the modern medical establishment. The story of the Rockefeller/allopathic takeover of society's medical sphere and elimination of alternative healing modalities was well documented nearly half a century ago in the book Rockefeller Medicine Men, Medicine and Capitalism in America by C. Richard Brown. Brown begins by telling us something particularly relevant to our situation today. Technological change does not determine healthcare. Technology is a tool of the medical profession and the corporate class. Special interests determine what technology is developed. This is partially driven by the social control function with which the elite has invested the medical profession. Thus did modern medicine and corporate capitalism come of age in the same era. Managers and shareholders naturally look after their own interest. In the case of medicine, members of the corporate class acting mainly through philanthropic foundations. Of course, they claimed these practices would benefit society as a whole, reflecting the phony altruistic facade employed consistently by the elite-controlled politics of the progressive era. In the late 19th century, the medical profession lacked wealth and status. Medicine at that time was pluralistic in its theories of disease with several warring factions. Existing professional organizations had little or no control over new doctors entering the field. By the 1930s, this all changed. Control was through licensure and accreditation of teaching hospitals and medical schools. The AMA came to dominate research, clinical and scientific orientations. All other healers were excluded. Physicians were increasingly drawn only from the middle and upper classes. Doctors rose rapidly in income, power, and status, much faster than other segments. The public expressed more trust in the medical profession than any other American institution. This made them very useful as an instrument of control. Healthcare responsibilities were shifted downward to the healthcare workforce. In 1900, 90% of physicians were in private practice. Now it's about half. Doctors have found themselves in conflict with hospitals, insurance companies, and others who wished to work off the business model instituted by the Rockefeller Medicine Men. By the early 20th century, medical schools had long conflicted with practitioner-dominated medical societies. Prior to the Rockefeller reconstruction of the medical establishment, medical schools were run by physicians for their own profit. By way of financing, now they came to be run by universities and responsive to the interest of the money-granting foundations. And, since World War II, government funding sources managed by careerists trained and beholden to the Rockefeller establishment. Expensive, centralized, and capital-intensive technologies were encouraged. This encouraged the growth of hospitals and insurance companies, all of which required Rockefeller financing. The government and foundations also favored the Rockefeller business model known as rationalizing medical care. This process took place mostly 1900 to 1930. Given the opportunity to become completely dominant by the catastrophic Spanish flu pandemic 1918 to 1920. The foundations aligned with hospitals and medical schools. The government, firmly in the hands of corporate capitalists, took over foundations and opened the floodgates of the U.S. Treasury. Philanthropic foundations emerged, largely to train professionals and managers and develop universities. Rockefeller's philanthropy took the lead to develop programs to legitimize the social structure of capital society and to provide for its technical needs. Modern scientific medicine was not merely a natural outcome of combining science and medicine in the 19th century. It sought to enhance the position of the profession in society and succeeded because it won the support of dominant segments of the American class structure, the powerful. Louis Pasteur, for whom the process of pasteurization is named, did the same thing decades earlier on a smaller scale. Through a lack of ethics and a keen sense of what the upper class wanted, Pasteur was able to overshadow his chief competitor, Antoine Béchamp, a fact which elevated the germ theory of disease over what is now called terrain therapy. This approach perceives disease as caused by mineral deficiency and toxin accumulation, as opposed to Pasteur's germ theory of disease, which required capital-intensive technologies, drugs, and surgeries, and thus enabled those with the capital to control this system, and led to the next step, which was to enable the system to control society and people. And as we see happening at a rapid pace these last 3 years. Much more on the germ theory and viral causes of disease later. The Reverend Frederick T. Gates was the architect of the major Rockefeller medical philanthropies. Gates was a star in the Baptist Church who centralized power in that denomination in line with Rockefeller co-option of religious institutions, weakening the local bonds of community fostered by independent churches. Gates did not ponder too deeply on religious theology, purveying a watered-down Christianity that basically consisted of the same ethics one would find in any religion. Gates did, however, care a whole lot about money, and no less than John D. Rockefeller called him the best businessman that he had ever seen. So Gates developed a scientific medical establishment which explained disease in a way that was similar to the worldview of corporate capitalism. It thereby became an ideological weapon to formulate a new culture appropriate to that worldview. It exonerated capitalism's vast iniquities and reckless practices that often shorten the lives of members of the working class. It promoted the cult of technocratic expertise, which is, just like today, demanding that we trust and obey those who know better than we do. The financing of scientific medical schools to crank out these experts required tremendous amounts of capital, and those who provided the capital imposed policy. Gates made it clear that medicine must serve capital society and be controlled by the capitalist foundations and the capitalist universities. By 1929, one Rockefeller Foundation, the General Education Board, the GEB, appropriated more than $78 million to medical schools to implement the strategy, and Gates's perspective was firmly established. For the time being, Gates kept the state out by not giving money to the state universities. In time, they came to see the state as a necessary aid and took the steps to get their own people in place in the states. The states would then emphasize a technological medicine which ignored some of the most important determinants of disease and death. Gates simply did in medicine what he had already done in religion. When he first took over Rockefeller's philanthropies, he stopped the giving to individual churches and made them obtain it from centralized denominational boards. This increased the board's power over the far-flung congregations. See, the model I'm talking, when I say capitalism, I don't mean mom and pop capitalism, which I'm 100% for. I'm referring to this kind of corporate capitalism, this highly centralized, capital-intensive capitalism. A virtual revolution transformed American medicine from 1890 to 1925. Medical science became a powerful force in society. This was attributable to several historical developments. Number one, industrial capitalism created a new role for science in its application. Scientists jumped at the opportunity to serve the new masters of society. In return, they got money, facilities for their work, and prestige. Larger production organizations required professional managers who were trained in the universities. This came to include scientific research. Number two, by embracing scientific medicine, leading practitioners bolstered their crusade for monopoly over the practice of medicine. Allopathic academic medicine established itself as the only legitimate and professional approach in matters of health and illness. And number three, foundations secured enormous power in medicine by funding medical schools, especially from the 1910s to the 1930s, to serve the scientific, educational, and cultural needs of a Rockefeller-based corporate capitalism, which commenced a long drive towards full spectrum dominance of society. Under the guise of extending the benefits of healthcare more fairly, recommendations were pushed that favored hospitals over private practitioners, thus making it easier to regulate. In the 1930s, moves were made for socialized medicine, but the well-funded AMA lobby was able to defeat it. In this emerging mode, hospitals provided doctors with new diagnostic and treatment facilities. Doctors themselves could not provide the capital to build and equip hospitals. They had to depend on philanthropy, government, and commercial banks for the needed capital. They had to look beyond the billing of individual patients to the resources of insurance companies and the government. Physicians became more dependent on medical schools to produce advances that might be applied to medical practices to train new members of the profession in science-based medical theories and techniques. Medical schools also had to socialize new members to norms that made the profession cohesive and powerful. They also depended on drug companies. Drugs became the essential base of their practice, and prescription drugs gave doctors new power by making the public see a physician in order to be allowed to obtain the fruits of medical research. Prescription drugs, hospital care, medical equipment and supplies, and health insurance all quickly became essential commodities of the medical kingdom over which physicians reigned. Previously, private practice medicine had been founded upon simple commodities that the physician himself could produce and sell. but technological medicine made physicians dependent on capital-intensive commodities, ones that required substantial investment and a good deal of hired labor to produce. With this commodification, physicians assumed a new role in the market as middlemen and claimed a monopoly of expertise and authority over healthcare over an increasing number of healthcare workers. Hospitals were hard hit by the Depression. The Julius Rosenwald Fund gave the American Hospital Association money to establish Blue Cross, an insurance program they hoped would provide stable income for hospitals, as well as centralizing and integrating local health services around hospitals.